How are you feeling? It's been a tough year. A year and a half later, we're still dealing with COVID and now the Delta variant. Doctors and nurses are burnt out, begging people to get vaccinated. Almost 700,000 Americans are dead, and there are still those who refuse to take the vaccine and wear a mask in public places. There's global warming. Last July was the hottest on record. There are devastating fires in California, Oregon, and Washington. There's an extreme drought in many states, and 40 million people depend on the Colorado River for water, which is now at its lowest level ever. How are you feeling? There was a January 6th storming of the US Capitol. Its objective was to stage a coup and kill those in power, including the vice president. There were $30 million in damages, and still many refused to acknowledge that it was anything more than a peaceful protest. Fake news and conspiracy theories continue to proliferate. There is an uptick in anti-Semitism and attacks on Asians. Just last year, we had the highest number of hate crimes since 2008. How are you feeling? In Afghanistan, the war has ended, but what is going to happen to our Afghani friends who were left behind? And what about the refugee crisis that is unfolding and the rest of that country's citizens? The earthquake in Haiti has killed 2,200 people and injured nearly 13,000, with 53,000 homes destroyed. And then they get a direct hit from Hurricane Grace. How are you feeling? Ethiopia's Tigray region is facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, with 350,000 people threatened by famine. The most severe starvation crisis in the world right now, caused by human conflict. The crisis that may be affecting us closest at home is the impact of the pandemic, with family members and friends trying to cope with the loved ones who are sick or have died, and with the economic impact it has had on many families, many who are at risk of being evicted and becoming homeless. All of this makes me feel sick. Making all of this worse is the fact that the state of politics today is worse than it's been since the Civil War. I went to visit my parents in Baltimore about 2 weeks ago. We made a trip up to Gettysburg one afternoon. We learned how the 3-day battle at Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle in the Civil War, with more than 50,000 estimated casualties. Standing in those fields where there were about 160,000 soldiers slaughtering each other under the command of the command of their generals, how could such savagery be glorified? We stood on the hill where Lincoln stood when he delivered the Gettysburg Address. What would he think if he knew that from that spot today, you can see a McDonald's and a Kentucky Fried Chicken? Worse still, what would Lincoln think about the systemic racism and income equality that continues to persist in our country? The voter suppression efforts in full swing in many states, and those who deny science and the reality of climate change. Sadly, of all these concerns, perhaps the most pressing is climate change. It's been said that we are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, and we are the last generation who can do anything about it. But how can we do anything but succumb to despair, given how I'm feeling right now? David Wallace Wells, the author of a #1 New York Times bestseller, The Uninhabitable Earth, he writes, "We have not developed much of a religion of meaning around climate change that might comfort us or give us purpose in the face of possible annihilation." I understand possible annihilation, but what does he mean by saying a religion of meaning around climate change? We can begin by asking, what wisdom and meaning does our religion offer in the midst of a climate crisis? Being a Jew, I learned, is about taking responsibility for our sacred obligations, whether to God, to our community, to our world. How are we to respond when the needs of the world are so massive, though, so overwhelming, so hard to even fathom? When burying our heads in the sand is just another form of climate change denial. How can we process this brutal reality? I believe that is the purpose of our religion, and the purpose of these high holy days in particular. I know that Rosh Hashanah is partly intended to be celebrated as a happy day. It's the birthday of the world and the beginning of the new year. But it is also the first of these 10 days of awe. Tomorrow morning, we will recite a prayer known as the Unatana Tokef. It reads, on Rosh Hashanah it is written and revealed. On Yom Kippur, the course of every life is sealed. How many shall pass on? How many shall thrive? Who shall live on? And who shall die? It goes on in quite stark and ominous terms, and then it concludes. Teshuva, tzedakah, Teshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, ma'avirin et roa hagazera. Which means our lives hang in a precarious balance from day to day, but teshuva and tefillah and tzedakah have the power to change how we experience life and its painful uncertainties. Tzedakah, as you probably know, literally means righteousness. It is our ability to pursue justice and to act from a place of clarity and generosity. Tefillah, as you probably know, means prayer. But on a deeper level, it is the ability to recognize and acknowledge our vulnerability and interdependence, and at the same time, to hold on to and articulate gratitude, hope, and awe. But the word I want to draw your attention to this evening is a word we usually only encounter this time of year. Teshuva. It means repentance, response, return. It's the ability to see things as they are, and then to move, to change course, to come back to center, to reconcile. Could these three values form the basis of a religion of meaning? Our religion? A way to find our way through this morass of conflict, a bloody battlefield as it may seem? The answer, I believe, is yes. I believe it begins with teshuva, the very act of turning itself. There was once a rabbi who asked her students how far it is from east to west. One student said, well, as far as you can see from there to there. No. Another shouted, 3,000 miles from the East Coast to the West Coast. No. Another proudly asserted, 12,000 miles, half the circumference of the earth. No. The rabbi said, it's the step or two it takes to turn and face the opposite direction. It's a very short distance, but a radically significant act that is possible for anyone. One could call it the Great Turning. In the 1990s, Joanna Macy began speaking about the Great Turning. She's long been an environmental activist, author of 12 books, a scholar of Buddhism, general systems theory, and deep ecology. At 92, she lives in Berkeley and still speaks and teaches internationally, although probably now by Zoom. She has served as adjunct professor to several graduate schools in the Bay Area, including, I believe, the California Institute of Integral Studies. Yeah, okay, thank you, Chip. As she describes it, the Great Turning is a shift from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining network of communities. She says it's the third major revolution of human existence after the agricultural and industrial revolutions. But the most remarkable feature of this historical moment on Earth, she says, is not that we are on the way to destroying the world. We've actually been on the way for quite a while. Is that we are beginning now to wake up as from a millennia-long sleep to a whole new relationship with our world, to ourselves, and to each other. Perhaps the most visible aspect of the Great Turning is the actions being taken to slow the damage to the earth and its beings. These actions include all the political, legislative, and legal initiatives, as well as direct actions like blockades, boycotts, civil disobedience, and other forms of refusal. Work of this kind buys time. It saves some lives and some ecosystems and species and cultures, but it is insufficient by itself to bring about the change that is needed. The second aspect of the Great Turning is looking at structural causes and developing structural alternatives to free ourselves and our planet from the damage being inflicted by an industrial growth society. To do that, we must understand its dynamics. What are the tacit agreements that create obscene wealth for a few, while gradually but steadily impoverishing the rest of humanity? What interlocking causes indenture us to an insatiable economy that uses our earth as a resource to be exploited and depleted? It takes courage and confidence in our own common sense to look at it with realism. And in doing so, we demystify the workings of the global economy. When we see how it operates, we are less tempted to demonize the politicians and CEOs who are actually enslaved by it. And for all the apparent might of the industrial growth society, we can also see its fragility, how dependent it is on our obedience, and how doomed it is to devour itself. In addition to learning how the present system works, we are also developing alternatives. In communities like ours, new social and economic arrangements are taking root. Not waiting for national and state politics to catch up, we are coming together, each other, to take action. And we see a lot of that right here on the Coastside. Flowing from our creativity and collaborative efforts, these actions may look marginal, but they hold the seeds to a brighter future. But these structural alternatives cannot take root and survive without the third aspect of the Great Turning, a shift in consciousness. The alternative structures must mirror what we want and how we relate to the earth and to each other. They require, in other words, a shift in our perception of reality. Fortunately, that shift is already underway in the proliferation of activists and organizations who are on the leading edge of healthy and mindful living. A lot of you are right here in this community. The frame of mind that results from this shift in consciousness can save us from succumbing to panic on the one hand, or despair and paralysis on the other. It can help us resist the temptation to stick our heads in the sand or to turn on each other, as is the norm these days in politics. It can help us find the equilibrium and clarity we need in order to adopt a pragmatic approach to life and to be leaders in an otherwise polarized and traumatized world. we are learning to lead in love. This is the key to renewal and our capacity to thrive. Among the myriad of problems and the myriad of solutions, these three aspects of the great turning can help us find our way. Actions to slow the damage to Earth and its beings, looking at structural causes and developing alternatives, a shift in consciousness. And as I think about it, these three aspects line up nicely with the language of our liturgy, our religion of meaning. Actions to slow the damage of Earth and its beings is the work of our hands, tzedakah. Looking at structural causes and developing alternatives is the work of our minds, where thought finds expression in language. That's tefillah. And a shift in consciousness could be thought of as the work of our hearts. That's Teshuva. All three of these aspects of life are essential. But tonight, and as we enter these next 10 days of awe, I want you to be mindful of how we are participating in this great turning with our hands, our minds, whether in thought or in speech, and with our hearts. Musar is a spiritual practice that many of you are now acquainted with that integrates all three. And we'll talk about that in the days ahead. But for now, we need to see Judaism as a religion of meaning just by looking at it deeper than we have before. Looking at it to understand its meaning, the meaning of these days of awe and its liturgy, and the meaning of Teshuva. What is the distance between east and west? This act of turning is, in itself, the great turning.